Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Hi There with Rabbi Leah. It's Thursday morning. Looks like it's going to be another gorgeous day. The sun is shining. I hear the birds chirping. And I started my day with a fabulous fruit smoothie with chocolate protein powder and peanut butter and vanilla almond milk. And so I'm raring to go today. I don't know about you, but I'm sure raring to go. And I remembered this morning to close the door to my bedroom because you would see that your rabbi has not yet made her bed today, but I will. I will get there as soon as I'm done teaching this morning. So yesterday we started talking about Pirkei Avot and the fact that this is a part of the Mishnah that is traditionally studied during these weeks between Passover and Shavuot. And so we're doing what Jews have done for hundreds and hundreds of years. I wanted to further explain just really quickly the difference between oral Torah and written Torah. And you may have heard those terms used, and you've probably heard them frequently and not known 100% what they meant. So, when Moses went up to the top of Mount Sinai, he received both from God. He received the written Torah, which is the Ten Commandments and what we know of as the five books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, um, the Chumash, however you want to refer to those five books. But that's not all that Moses got. Jewish tradition says that Moses got everything else as well, all of the oral law. So, in actuality, what Moses received was the Torah, the entire Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the commentaries, the Shulchan Aruch, the Tosefta, all this enormous body of Jewish law and literature. Some of it was revealed at Sinai. All of it was revealed at Sinai to Moses, and some of it Moses gave to the people. And over the past 5,780 years, minus however many years it was until we got to Moses, about 1,200, 1,300 years, that tradition has been passed on orally. But traditional Judaism believes that Moses got it all when he went to Mount Sinai. It's just that some of it is being revealed later on. So if you were to have this conversation with an Orthodox rabbi, they would tell you that the Mishnah, the Talmud, and everything else was also given to Moses on Sinai, just revealed at a different time during Jewish and human history. So even today, when Orthodox rabbis or traditional rabbis are writing commentaries and responsa literature and so on, the belief is that that's still divinely inspired and that actually it was all given at Mount Sinai, but we're just kind of uncovering it now. Okay, so that is one belief. Um, Perhaps not this rabbi's belief, but it doesn't make the literature any less inviting and any less important. So when we study Pirkei Avot, we are doing something that Jews have done for generations and generations. And it's an interesting process in that it connects us, I think, in a very distinct and interesting way. And you'll have to forgive me, I have lots of notes here that I'm going to be sharing with you. So, usually, as I mentioned yesterday, usually Mishnaic tractates like Pirkei Avot would have some kind of commentary that would accompany them. But the tractate of Pirkei Avot is unusual because it does not have the traditional types of commentaries that we see with other tractates. There was, in the 10th century, a gentleman by the name of Saadia Gaon. And Saadia was not his first name. Saadia is a term like sir or mister. And a Saadia was an excellency, somebody who was really top notch in terms of their Judaic knowledge, specifically in the area of Mishnah and Talmud. And Saadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th century, was one of the rabbis to whom Jewish communities from all over the world would write to and ask questions of him because his knowledge of Jewish law was encyclopedic. And it's been customary since the time of Excellency Gaon in the 10th century to study between Passover and Shavuot. So that's really when it started. And it's also customary to proceed and conclude each chapter of the Mishnah that we study with a special verse from somewhere else in the Mishnah. So this was a really typical thing that the ancient rabbis liked to do, which was in order to show off their knowledge of the Torah or of the Mishnah, they would bring together verses from disparate places. And, it was kind of like the rap battles that some of the rap singers have nowadays, where they'll battle against each other for the best. Well, the rabbis did that, except not with rap. They did it with Mishnah. And they did it in order to, it was hyperbolic. They did it in order to show off how much they knew, their knowledge. So Pirkei Avot, as I mentioned to you, contains many, many, many familiar rabbinic sayings, things that you are going to know that you didn't know, that you did not know came from Pirkei Avot. And we're going to be looking at those, and you'll say, I know that one. I didn't ever realize it came from Pirkei Avot. So you will be amazed at what you find out here. And you're going to hear some really, really famous rabbinic names like Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, and so on. And, these are some of the sages who really gave us some of the most magnificent and interesting pieces of our rabbinic literature that clearly were important enough that we are still studying these things today. Okay. There are major themes throughout Pirkei Avot, including showing kindness to others, respect for the other person, respecting God, seeking peace, taking precautions to avoid getting into any kind of a transgression, being humble, being circumspect in prayer, combining Torah study with labor. All of these ancient sages had occupations. They were farmers, shoemakers, blacksmiths. They did all different kinds of things. So it was never intended for Torah study. And by Torah study, I mean not just studying Torah itself, but the broad range of studying halacha and so on and so forth. It was never meant for the rabbis to sit there and only do that. In fact, there is a very famous rabbinic saying that says, Im ein kemach, ein Torah, ve'im ein Torah, ein kemach, which means if there isn't flour, like ground flour, there is no Torah. And without Torah, there is no flour. And by flour, F-L-O-U-R, the rabbis meant real world sustenance, real food. So the Torah gives you spiritual sustenance, but you also better have a job. Otherwise, you're not going to eat. And so these two things go hand in hand. So all these rabbis had careers. They all had jobs, and learning Torah or learning Judaism was also part of their labor and also important. We also learn about things. There go Tootsie and Snickers barking at something outside. You'll have to forgive me. They also learned about things like not exploiting one's learning, being careful with speech, not seeking rewards, not leaping to judgment of another person, being fair and deliberate in legal decisions, being fair and deliberate in business, taking action now, not waiting, seeking an even temperament, and making sure that the punishment matches the sin. And so the rabbis of Pirkei Avot, of this particular section of the Mishnah, were concerned about an ethical and moral way of living life. How do we get along with other people? How do we treat other people? What are fair business practices? What do we do when we come across a certain situation? And we're not talking halakha here. We're not talking legalities. We're talking human behavior, getting along with others, and how to treat other people with kindness, with generosity, and with fairness. So, what I'd like to do with you is, there was one other thing I wanted to let you know about that's kind of interesting. There is a practice in parts of Pirkei Avot, which we're going to be studying, that talk about what are known as zugot. And when you listen to that word zugot, it may sound to you a little bit like zygote, like an embryo when it just splits into two cells. And a zugot, the word zugot, is twins or a pair. And we are going to get to a part of Pirkei Avot where the rabbis seem to be paired up with one another. Now, it's interesting because you'll see that Rabbi so-and-so used to say three things, and Rabbi so-and-so used to say three things, and kind of giving them equal airtime, so to speak. But yesterday we talked about the fact that one of the easiest ways to remember something is to attribute some sort of a numeric system to it. And so when we read these various Mishnahs, and by the way, the whole book is called the Mishnah, but each little paragraph, each little pasuk, each little statement is also called a Mishnah. So when we get to these different little pithy sayings, you're going to see that Rabbi so-and-so used to say something, and Rabbi so-and-so used to say something. And then it will say, and each of them said three things. And that makes it easier for us to remember what they said. And I'm going to give you some examples early on that make the Mishnah so memorizable because of the easy way in which it's written. So we're going to start with Mishnah 1 of chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot. Now, the most important question that somebody might ask is, okay, so Moses got the Torah, both the oral law and the written law, at Mount Sinai. And how did he get it to me? Or how did he get it to us? And by the way, does it really matter that he got it to us? Why is it that it is still something that is important for us to be looking at in our own day and time in the 21st century? So how did this transmission get from Moses, which is, 3,500 years ago or more, to us today? And the very first Mishnah of the first chapter of Pirkei Avot begins to talk about what we call Kabbalat HaTorah, the transmission or receiving of the Torah. So you know the term Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat is the greeting of the Sabbath, how we first say hello. It's how we first approach something. So this Kabbalah, Kabbalat Torah, this receiving of the Torah, is a very critical piece. because it says, well, it went from this person to this person to these people, and then on to these people and these people. And guess what? It finally got to you. So here's how we're going to learn how that happened. Very first Mishnah says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. Okay, so we're still not to us, right? We're still not to us. We're with the men of the great assembly, who were a long time ago. So Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and then he transmitted it to Joshua. Why to Joshua? Well, Joshua was the person to whom Moses gave the responsibility of actually taking the Israelites across the River Jordan and into the land. Because, of course, Moses died before the Israelites crossed into the promised land. And Joshua is going to lead the Israelites through the various battles with the peoples who are living in the land, and eventually the Israelites are going to conquer the land. So Joshua is a critical character here. And if you don't give it to your protege, how's it going to get anywhere else after that, right? So Moses transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua then transmitted it to the elders. And who were the elders? What they call the Zikanim. They were the elders of the Israelites who had lived some of their lives in the desert as they crossed before they entered the land of Israel. They were the sages who had the historical, cultural history of this fledgling nation of Israel. They then passed it on to the prophets. Okay, so for a time, it was the responsibility of the prophets to pass on, to receive Kabbalat, to receive the transmission of the Torah to them. And the prophets, as we know, there are many of them. And in the second book of the Torah, which is called Nevi'im, or the second book of the Hebrew Bible, we read about the different prophets. We have one book that's called the Major Prophets and another book that's called the Minor Prophets. And we read, usually it goes something like this. God calls to a prophet to go tell the people something. The prophet says, "Not me, God. I ain't getting involved. I don't want to do that." They're eventually convinced to do it. They go and tell the people. They speak to the people. The people rebel against them. Some of them end up dead. It was not a great gig to be a prophet. Let's put it that way. Some of them were fine, but others, the people really rebelled against them. Someday we'll study the prophets together, and it'll be a lot of fun. So Joshua gave it to the elders, and the elders gave it to the prophets, and then the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. And who were the men of the great assembly? The men of the great assembly refers to the leaders who arose around the time of the building of the second temple. And that was in about 500 before the Common Era. And this was the temple that's eventually going to get destroyed in 70 CE. It was the second temple. First temple was Solomon's temple. The second temple was a temple that was built around 500 before the Common Era. Let me take care of that for a minute. So the men of the Great Assembly were probably a judicial body that had legislative powers, but there's not a whole lot known about them. But we're kind of assuming that from the little description that we do have, that they were men of power. They were judges. They litigated disputes and so on. So here we have these 4 steps of transmission. Moses gets it to Joshua. Joshua gets it and gives it to the elders. The elders get it and give it to the prophets, and the prophets get it and give it to the men of the great assembly. Now, the men of the great assembly is still, 2,500 years ago. So we're a long way from us today. The Mishnah then has a second part, and it goes on to say this. The men of the great assembly said three things, and here we go with the numbers that helps us to memorize. They said, be patient in the administration of justice, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So the first two of those are pretty clear. Be patient in the administration of justice. Don't jump to judicial conclusions. Don't have an opinion or a judicial decision before you hear the case. Give the sides equal time. Be fair in judgment. Okay, that's pretty easy to understand. The men of the Great Assembly also said something else. They said, raise up many disciples. So what does that mean? Find a lot of people that you can teach your knowledge to and that are going to continue teaching and will maintain your legacy after you're gone. Because if you don't do it, they're not going to do it on their own. And what is a disciple? A disciple is somebody else who knows Torah. So the men of the Great Assembly would say, be patient in judgment, raise up many disciples. And then the third thing they say is, make a fence around the Torah. Okay, so we know that they're not talking about a physical fence. They're not talking about taking your Torah scrolls and putting them in a place and putting a fence around them. This is a metaphorical fence. This is a, for lack of a better word, a virtual fence as opposed to a real fence. And what it means is that at any given time, that you can protect what's in the Torah. It should be your duty to do so. That you don't stray from it, and that you don't tweak it, but that anytime there is either an attack against it or somebody who wants to change something in it, you are to protect it by continuing to observe in the way that it's been laid out. So the men of the Great Assembly used to say three things. And, we may say, well, it's pretty obvious that if you are a teacher, which the men of the Great Assembly were, that you're going to seek out a lot of disciples. But not all rabbis thought so. And particularly two of the rabbis in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that we're going to read about, Rabbi Shammai and Rabban Gamliel, were known for not allowing those whom they deemed disqualified to participate in discussions in the halls of study. So they were a little, they had some hubris. Maybe they didn't think somebody was quite up to participating in the conversation, and so they wouldn't let them. So they were very, very, very particular, and perhaps a little, well, I'll think of the word, but perhaps they were a little, their expectations were a little too high, and they were not as welcoming to more disciples. But this whole notion of making a fence around the Torah is a principle in Judaism that's of supreme importance. And here's why. There are lots of laws in the Torah that are not strictly obligatory for a person to do, but rather they were instituted later on by the rabbis. And the reason they was to assist in preventing a Jew from transgressing a Torah law. So as an example, it's the use of money on Shabbat, okay? The Torah itself doesn't prohibit using money on Shabbat, but the rabbi said you shouldn't use money on Shabbat because you may end up writing, I pay you, you write me a receipt, something like that. And writing is prohibited by the Torah. So this making a fence around the Torah is protecting the Torah in a way from the possibility of transgressing. The possibility of transgressing. And as I said, it may not actually be halakha, but it's something that would prevent us from transgressing one of the commandments in the Torah. So what we have now is the transmission of the Torah to Joshua, to the elders, to the prophets, and to the men of the great assembly. And we're still waiting to find out how we're going to get it. So now we're going to get to the next important guy, and his name was Shimon the Righteous. And this is the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avot in the first chapter, and it says the following. Shimon the Righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. So at some point in time, the Great Assembly ceased to be, and Shimon the Righteous was the last remnant of this great group of men who were litigators and judges and so on. And he used to say, the world stands upon three things: upon the Torah, upon the temple service, and upon the practice of acts of piety. Now, I read that to you in the English, and I will bet you know it better in the Hebrew. And it goes like this. Hu haya omer, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed, al ha'torah, va'al ha'avodah, va'al gimilut chasadim. The world stands on three things: on Torah, on avodah, which at that period of time meant temple service, meaning what the priests and the Levites did in the service. Nowadays, that means worship. And on the practice of acts of piety. And what are acts of piety? Gimilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. So, we are getting closer to what we understand, because you and I are very familiar with Al Shlosha Devarim. We sing it almost every Shabbat morning when we are doing Hakafah, when we are parading with the Torah. And so I'd like to end this session of Chai There with Rabbi Leah by singing Al Shlosha Devarim. Here we go. Al Shlosha Devarim. Are you singing? Al Shlosha Devarim. Al Shlosha Devarim ha'olam omed. Al Shlosha Devarim. Al Shlosha Devarim. Al Shlosha Devarim ha'olam omed. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. So now we're getting much more close to our own practice, because Al Shlosha Devarim is something that we use weekly in our own liturgy. We sing it when we parade with the Torah, and it's words that you know, but that come directly from the men of the Great Assembly. And this one remnant, this one man whose name was Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous, who was like one of the last vestiges of this great assembly. So that's all for today. I don't want to bite off way more than we can chew. I'm still waiting for your input. I'm still waiting for your emails. Send them to me, lherz@seacrestvillage.org, or if you'd rather call and leave me a message on my cell phone, you could do that as well, whatever you'd like to do. But in the meantime, I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. Tomorrow's Friday. We'll talk a little bit about Shabbos. Lehitraot, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.